We are less than 2 weeks away from the NFL draft, so I wanted to run through my final rookie rankings while also giving my fantasy comparisons for each player from a median, an elite, and a bust standpoint, just to put one final stamp on this class before the NFL draft. So we'll start at the quarterback position with my QB1 and the consensus QB1 in the class, Cam Ward. Now, I like Cam Ward a lot. I think that he's honestly an underrated prospect in the sense that people don't really view him as an A-tier guy, but I think he actually is. Not in any sort of like generational way, like he's not like Caleb Williams or Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence, or Andrew Luck, but I think that he's fairly on par, if not even better than the CJ Strouds, the Drake Mays, the Justin Herberts of the world that we've had the past few years. So when you're talking about fantasy comparisons for Cam Ward, I think his median outcome is Baker Mayfield. Not in the sense of Baker's career arc of being booted out of Cleveland, then being a journeyman for a couple years until ultimately finding a home in Tampa, but more of Baker's just own floor and ceiling. He was an immediate starter, pretty much outperformed expectations on a bad team, and was a top 18 fantasy quarterback 3 years in a row to start his career. Then, once he got stability around him in terms of a good organization with really good weapons, he has been a QB1 in back-to-back seasons in Tampa Bay. And I think that that's Cam Ward, who can do well without the best situation around him. He proved that in Miami, but give him some really good to even great weapons around him and just watch him work. On the high end, I think that we could see him get close to a Matthew Stafford type career. Now, it did take a couple of years for Stafford to get going, mainly due to injury in year 2, but from year 3 to year 9, Stafford was incredible. He rattled off 3 straight top 10 performances, then a down QB 16 year, and then 3 more top 10 seasons in a row once again. And then once he joined the LA Rams in the Super Bowl year with Cooper Kupp, he was QB5 on that year, and he's been a top 20 guy in each of the past 2 seasons as we've kind of reached the sunset of his career. Sure, having Calvin Johnson certainly helps any quarterback, but Stafford's also proved that he can do it with just about anyone, and that is just as much a credit to him for making his wide receivers as it is his wide receivers making him. Then on the low end, I think we're looking at a Mitch Trubisky here, a 4-year starter for the Chicago Bears to try to be their franchise quarterback, but it just never really clicked for him. He did have that 1 year in 2018 as the QB15 for fantasy. I believe that was also the year that he got his Pro Bowl nomination, so kind of crazy there, but he did get his shot to start. He didn't live up to it, and now he's just a solid backup quarterback. Now, my QB2 in this class is Jaxson Dart out of Ole Miss, a guy that I really like and I think is being slept on from a fantasy standpoint, especially because of his rushing ability. He's rushed for over 1,500 yards in his career, including a 600-yard rushing season in 2022, 8 rushing touchdowns in 2023. All of that to pair with his prolific passing numbers in 2024 of almost 4,300 yards and 29 touchdowns. So for me, his median fantasy comparison is Andy Dalton, who was an early second-round pick that the Bengals paired with A.J. Green in the same draft, and Dalton also had pretty sneaky rushing production at TCU. Look it up. In fact, through Dalton's first 7 years with the Bengals, he never finished below QB 18 and was actually a top 12 quarterback twice in his first 3 seasons. But eventually, A.J. Green got older. Dalton just really wasn't performing well because he was really just a mediocre quarterback. Things kind of fell apart in Cincinnati, and that's when they decided to dump him for Joe Burrow, and then Dalton began his veteran journeyman career. Now, Dart's upside comparison would be Dak Prescott, not because I'm predicting him to fall to day 3 and then just climb a depth chart instantly, but it's what Dak has done pretty much every season he's been in the league for fantasy football. He has 5 top 10 seasons, 2 more top 18 seasons, and the only reason that he has 2 seasons outside the top 30 on his resume is because he got hurt those years in 2020 and last year in 2024. But every year he's played 16 or 17 games, he has been a top 13 fantasy quarterback. And while he's not as much of a rushing quarterback now, he was early on with 3 consecutive seasons of 250 or more rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. Then Dart's low-end comparison would be Jimmy Garoppolo, especially because it is possible that he gets drafted by a team who views him more as a good backup, who they can try to mold into a starter in a couple years, which is exactly what happened with Jimmy Garoppolo. He just happened to play behind the greatest quarterback of all time. But once he got a starting job with San Fran, he was the QB 16, then the QB 18, then the points per game QB 20 because he only played in 12 games that season. Then it was Brock Purdy's turn. So if he lands somewhere else as a QB2, it might take a couple years before he gets his shot at starting, and then he might be okay, but he might also just be another bridge to a better long-term answer for whatever franchise he goes to. Now, next up at QB3 is Shedeur Sanders, which if you watched my video on overrated rookies in this class, you would know that I'm really not the biggest fan of Shedeur, but that doesn't mean that he still can't be solid in the NFL. My median comparison for Sanders is Teddy Bridgewater, which might sound kind of harsh, but did you know that Teddy has played 13 or more games in 4 seasons in his career, and he has finished as a top 24 quarterback in all 4 of those seasons. It's not anything sexy, but he can get it done as an NFL game manager and be in that 14 to 16 points per game range for fantasy, which is an okay QB2. His upside comparison is basically the king of game managers right now, but with a lot more upside in the right moments, which is Derek Carr. Now, Carr started his career looking like the potentially next big thing. It just never really translated to high-end fantasy production. But Carr has been a strong QB2 every single year up through 2023 as a top 20 quarterback in each of his first 10 seasons, including 5 top 14 seasons. He's just never had enough juice to get him into the top 10 for fantasy, but he's a more than solid NFL quarterback, and he has been for years. And the bust comp for Shedeur is pretty much Zach Wilson. All of the hype pre-draft, especially after the combine, after his pro day, a top 3 pick in the NFL draft, but it just never really worked. He had his shot. You can't say that he wasn't given a fair chance at playing time, but the situation, the coaching staff, the offense, none of it really helped him, and he himself just wasn't a good quarterback. He's become a name now that you wince at when you look back at that 2021 class. Not to say that that 2021 class has turned out to be anything great, but it still hurts whenever you look back and you see that Zach Wilson was the second pick off the board, and Shedeur might just be that in 4 to 5 years looking back at the 2025 class. And to round out my quarterback rankings, since I don't really think anybody else matters at all after pretty much the top 4, we do have Jalen Milroe as my QB4. Now, I really don't believe that Milroe should be a first rounder in a couple of weeks, but I wouldn't be shocked if he was. Really, I think Milroe could be Colin Kaepernick, who was a very early second-round pick, got some games in year 2, which was the Super Bowl year for the Niners. Then he held that starting role for 2 more years before just being blackballed out of the NFL. But he was a solid quarterback, and I think that had all of that off-field stuff just didn't happen, he would have kept playing into his 30s and been like a Tyrod Taylor kind of player as his career went on. On the high end, I think he can be what people want Justin Fields to be, which, again, Fields is not a good NFL quarterback. I don't care what you say. I don't care if he's never been given a fair shake offensively or that he was 4-2 in Pittsburgh before they went to Russell Wilson. He is not a good NFL quarterback. I'm a Steelers fan. I can say that, period. But he is a good fantasy quarterback. He's an elite fantasy quarterback because of his legs. And then sometimes he can do things with his arm. But it's all rushing upside. It's because we value rushing so much for quarterbacks for fantasy that because that's what Jalen Milroe excels at, that's what he's going to do in the NFL, and that's why he can be good for fantasy football. If he can be a better passer, then he can be what people want Justin Fields to be as a franchise quarterback who doesn't bounce around a couple times for starting jobs. But again, that is only if Jalen Milroe does get better as a passer. But on the low end, it is entirely possible that the NFL sees all of the traits in Jalen Milroe, but just doesn't really value them highly, and he falls to day 3 and is just like Dorian Thompson-Robinson, a fun backup name who got some chances to start, but just never really held onto the job, and is just a guy in the NFL. All right, now on to the running backs, the real meat of this 2025 draft class. And of course, we start with Ashton Jeanty, who I think, median comparison, is Maurice Jones-Drew. It's a very easy comp to make. MJD was that small bowling ball of a human being with sub 4.4 speed, and Jeanty is also a small bowling ball at 5'8", 211 pounds. I mean, just look at what he looked like with his shirt off at the pro day. Holy crap, dude. And I'm not really sure if he is a sub 4.4 guy, but he is definitely pretty close. MJD rattled off 6 straight top 13 seasons once he entered the league, with 3 top 4 seasons and a RB8 rookie finish. The longevity really wasn't there for MJD, but if you told me that I get that type of production instantly from Ashton Jeanty, I'm taking that 10 times out of 10 with the rookie 101. Now, if Maurice Jones-Drew is the median comparison, his upside comp is probably something serious, which it most definitely is, because it is LaDainian Tomlinson. Now, comparing rookies to one of the greatest players of all time is usually a horrible proposition, but if we're talking legitimate like top 10, top 5% outcomes for Ashton Jeanty, LaDainian Tomlinson has to be in that conversation. You're talking about the elite production every single season. 1,500 plus yards, double-digit touchdowns every year from year 1 to year 8. Game changer, longevity. That is what Ashton Jeanty was in college, and that is his ultimate ceiling in the NFL as well. And as for his low-end comp, I'm going to give it to Devonta Freeman, who did have those 2 seasons of insane production with an RB1 overall finish, but that's all it really was. He burned so incredibly bright that there was just no more gas in the tank to keep going after that. And even then, those 2 seasons, he never broke 1,100 rushing yards, but he scored enough. He was used enough as a receiver to be elite for fantasy football, but it wasn't game-breaking usage, wasn't game-breaking production, and there's pretty much zero longevity after the fact, especially once those injuries really took hold. Now, next up, my running back 2 is Omarion Hampton, who I think is an absolutely tremendous running back. I'm giving him the median comparison of Arian Foster, another running back that is very near and dear to my heart, as you can see. Now, Foster wasn't a perfect running back, but in the right system, he absolutely thrived. With 4 seasons of 1,200 or more rushing yards, another 300 to 600 receiving yards, double-digit touchdowns. That is what I want from Omarion Hampton and what I think he can do very easily in the NFL, especially as a first-round pick and especially to a team that is ready to use him out the gates. But from a high-end comparison, I think he can be Ezekiel Elliott, who is just a perennial elite fantasy running back. 6 straight RB1 seasons to begin his career, another top 24 season in year 7, and then, yeah, the fall off was really quick, it was really fast, but the overall career that Zeke had in Dallas was incredible as a projected top 5 or even top 3 fantasy running back basically every single season. But on the low end, a blast from the past, if you remember this guy, Ryan Matthews with 1T from the San Diego Chargers. He was the 12th overall draft pick in 2010 and had 2 1,000-yard seasons in year 2 and year 4, but the touchdowns really weren't there. The receiving usage was just kind of okay, and he never really got things going. He had some injury issues and just was like an okay RB3 more often than not. Now on to my RB3, TreVeyon Henderson, another great prospect with full 3-down capabilities if he can stay healthy. Plus, we have the pass catching work, we have the speed, the big playability. It is all there for TreVeyon Henderson. And that is why, to me, his median comparison is DeAndre Swift, which may not sound great, especially given what Swift has done the past couple years. But remember, Swift was pretty good in Detroit. He just fought through some injuries that affected his playing time, but Swift has never actually been outside the top 24. Even this past season in Chicago, RB19 overall, RB24 in points per game. In Detroit, he had 2 top 18 finishes, one of which was actually a top 10 point per game finish that he only played 13 games. So when DeAndre Swift was healthy, he was great, especially in Detroit. So we just need TreVeyon to also stay healthy, which is what we needed him to do at Ohio State. And he can be a really good back for fantasy football, even in a non-workhorse role like what Swift has mostly been or had been in Detroit. Now on the high end, I think TreVeyon can get to LaShawn McCoy. They're very similarly sized. Shady was also a 2nd-round pick. And after a slower start to his rookie season, he rattled off 8 straight top 24 finishes in both Philadelphia and Buffalo, including 6 top 12 seasons. He was an interesting player in terms of volume. He never really consistently saw high rush attempt totals on either team. Sometimes he would break 300 carries, but he lived more in that 240 to 270 carry range. But he also had a healthy dose of receiving volume with 40 to 50 receptions a year, and that made Shady a great fantasy asset as an RB1 across both teams, which TreVeyon can do if the team is willing to use him as their guy, and of course, he stays healthy. But on the low end, I think TreVeyon could be CJ Spiller. Oh, what could have been with CJ Spiller, the 9th overall pick in the 2010 draft. He had some usage. He had 100 touches in year 1, 150 in year 2, 250 and 235 touches in years 3 and 4, but just never really got going outside of one good season in year 3, then was pushed aside for LaShawn McCoy and ended his career on 4 teams in the span of 3 years. So if that happens to TreVeyon, especially if injuries start getting thrown into the mix for him in the NFL, kind of like they were at Ohio State, I can see him being a very hopeful prospect, but also somebody that we look back on and just say, man, what could have been with TreVeyon Henderson. Now I'm going to group my RB4 and RB5 together because as prospects, they're very similar in terms of size, play style, projected draft capital. So at RB4, I do have Kaleb Johnson, and my RB5 is Quinshon Judkins. Both of their median comparisons are Najee Harris, which is a very reliable NFL back who maybe doesn't fully translate to fantasy due to inconsistent receiving production or not a ton of touchdowns depending on the offense that they both land on, but annual 1,000-yard guys, they're volume workhorses, they get 30-ish receptions. That is a quality fantasy RB2 with some upside. Now, speaking of upside, I think their ultimate ceilings are Leonard Fournette because coming out of college, Fournette was an absolute bruiser, and that translated very well to Jacksonville with an immediate RB10 rookie season, an injured year 2, but then was RB12 in points per game, then another RB7 season before weirdly getting cut, landing with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and putting up 2 more top 12 seasons in 3 years with Tampa Bay. What I do find the most interesting about Fournette's career, though, was a sudden boost in receiving usage in years 3 through 7. That final year in Jacksonville, then his time with Tom Brady in Tampa Bay. He wasn't known as a receiver coming out of LSU, and neither are Kaleb Johnson or Quinshon Judkins, but it's not to say that they can't do it. And I think Fournette offers the blueprint for their production should they be 250 plus carry backs, plus get another 50, 60, or even 70 receptions in a season. But on the low end, I see Brian Robinson, which is not a bad running back, but just someone that's really not good enough. He's a bruiser. He's a true 2-down guy who catches a few dump-offs here and there, but is really more touchdown dependent than anything, and that makes him a fantasy RB3 with RB2 or even RB1 weeks if he scores the touchdowns. Now, my RB6 in this class is Cam Skattebo, who is a fantastic grinder just like Kaleb Johnson and Quinshon Judkins, but offers a lot more in the receiving game and does not have that true breakaway speed. For a median comparison, I think that he could be James Robinson, which is a good comp based on what J-Rob was able to do to start his career. Remember, he had that RB7 season as a rookie, then an RB25 season in year 2, but what happened to James Robinson is also my ultimate fear for Cam Skattebo. The Jaguars had no ties to J-Rob as an undrafted rookie, which led them to draft Travis Etienne, and then it was Etienne plus then that Achilles injury that really drove the nail in the coffin for James Robinson. And I worry that if Skattebo is a day 3 pick, that even if he produces well early on, that doesn't mean the team's going to stick with him. It's the Jordan Howard, the Marlon Mack, the Dameon Pierce argument all over again. That's my fear for Cam Skattebo, but he could be really good early on if he gets the instant volume. Now on the high end, if Skattebo can land on a team willing to use him and continue using him, maybe that's with the day 2 pick, then I could see him being like James Conner, a 3-down bell cow who is great between the tackles and a proficient receiver too, with massive touchdown upside, but just doesn't really have those huge breakaway runs like guys more athletic than him, so he doesn't get the massive recognition of being a great NFL running back. But Conner was great in Pittsburgh, he's been great in Arizona, and if Skattebo finds a team like that that will use him throughout his career and not replace him, then James Conner is well within his range of outcomes. And on the low end, Skattebo might just be Zach Moss, a very solid team RB2 who can be the RB1 if the guy ahead of him gets hurt, but just never really has the volume consistently to be a startable fantasy asset. This might be his situation if he lands in Miami with Devon Achane or New Orleans with Alvin Kamara, Cincy with Chase Brown. It's that Tyler Algier role that's great for the NFL, but bad for fantasy football. Now, for the sake of the video, I'm not going to run through RB7 through 15 individually, also because I think the ordering of these guys is entirely up for debate and might be better off just letting the NFL tell us the order of these guys post-draft. But at least for now, pre-draft, my order for these guys goes Devin Neal, Damian Martinez, Jarquez Hunter, Bashal Tutin, Taj Brooks, RJ Harvey, DJ Giddens, Dylan Sampson, and Ollie Gordon. The fact that these guys are RB7 through 15 in this class is a real testament to the class as a whole, and I do think this is the strength of this running back class. It's the depth more so than the raw firepower at the top. It's in here that you're hoping to find guys that can be at best an Aaron Jones, a Chase Brown, a Kyron Williams. Chris Carson, Tony Pollard, but more likely you're just going to be getting good handcuffs like Tank Bigsby, Devin Singletary, Alexander Mattison, Blake Corum than really anything else, assuming they're not just straight up irrelevant like Trey Sermon or Tyrion Davis-Price or Keyshawn Vaughn. So sorry if I reopened a wound for anyone with those guys, but that really is the range of outcomes that you're looking at, all dependent on ultimate draft capital, even if all these guys are going to be day 3 and landing spot especially. All right, wide receiver time. And I've really come around to a kind of new ranking at the top just because I believe the talent is so apparent that it would be impossible to keep him off the field at the NFL level. So Travis Hunter is my rookie wide receiver 1. If he never played cornerback at all and was just a wide receiver prospect, he would easily be everybody's wide receiver 1 in the class. But because of the unknown of his true NFL position, we might get him at a discount, and I love every second of it. In terms of a straight wide receiver comparison, I really think that he's Garrett Wilson 2.0. It's the size, the speed, the athleticism, the route running, the way he can contort his body for some insane acrobatic catches. It was all there for Garrett Wilson out of Ohio State, and it's all there for Travis Hunter. And I do think that Hunter can do what Wilson's been doing, even on a kind of part-time basis. In 3 years, Wilson's career high is 1,104 yards and 7 touchdowns, both of which he did this past year. He's thrived on super high volume, but really low yards per target, and I think Hunter can do that, but more efficient on less volume, especially if he lands in New England with Drake May or even the Giants across from Malik Neighbors. I know they don't have a quarterback, but Hunter's talent can just win out and be a solid wide receiver 2 with upside, just like Garrett Wilson. Now, from a high-end standpoint, again, I really hate doing this with some of the best players that we've seen play this century, but I think Travis Hunter could reach prime Odell Beckham Jr. level. If he is a full-time wide receiver playing 90+% of snaps offensively, I see no reason why OBJ wouldn't be in Travis Hunter's range of outcomes with multiple 1,400 yard seasons, another couple just 1,000-yard seasons in the middle of his career. I mean, he didn't have the super longevity that you love to see at wide receiver, but maybe that's what you're going to get with Travis Hunter if he does try to play both ways. You might just get insane production early for a few years, then a quick descent into kind of irrelevance. Either way, Hunter is just that good and could be that elite for fantasy football. And on the downside, he might just be Curtis Samuel from an offensive standpoint. Maybe he tries to play both ways, but he mostly plays corner and is more of a 50% receiver snap kind of guy. And that leads to some manufactured touches, some really good games, but just no real consistency on a weekly or even yearly basis. And Samuel had a couple seasons with Carolina and Washington, but lived in that kind of 650 to 850 yard range for about 4 to 5 years in a row and just never really broke out of it. So if Hunter doesn't play that much receiver, that could be the production that we see from him as a more limited offensive player. Then at wide receiver 2, it is Tet McMillan, who is also very talented in his own right, but maybe there are concerns about true separation, his abilities, his speed, etc. I don't really share most of those concerns, but I understand why people might be hesitant because his profile historically has been kind of shaky. But as a median comparison, I've said multiple times on this channel that I just think that he's T. Higgins. And maybe you could see that as a more upside comparison, but we've gone through some really dark days with T. Higgins in Dynasty, mostly due to injury or also playing with Jamar Chase, but he only has 2 1,000-yard seasons. He's never been above 1,100 yards. He scored 6 or more touchdowns in all but 1 year, which is great, but we've always wanted him to do and be more. But it seems like he's locked into that high upside wide receiver 2 role for fantasy, and that just might be what Tet McMillan is as well. But on the high end, it's Mike Evans. I mean, I'm not really sure I need to go into much more detail with that one, but Evans is the blueprint for any perennial success as a big-bodied wide receiver who maybe doesn't separate the best, but is elite at contested catches, at high pointing the ball, red zone efficiency. Everything that we want Tet McMillan to be can just be summarized by wishing him to be the next Mike Evans. It's really as simple as that. And on the low end, Mike Williams might be the absolute floor. Another player with only 2 1,000-yard seasons, but it took 3 years to get there for his first one, then another 2 years for his second one. He's a very fine NFL wide receiver too. We always wanted more, but we just never really got it outside of those 1 to 2 seasons in his 7-year career with the LA Chargers. A very usable NFL wide receiver, yes. A difference-making fantasy receiver, no. Now, my rookie wide receiver 3 is Emeka Egbuka out of Ohio State, probably the safest wide receiver in the entire class. I've mentioned this comp a couple times throughout the past few months on this channel, but I think Egbuka is Robert Woods, and specifically Rams Robert Woods if he lands somewhere with a good quarterback. I don't know if Egbuka is ever going to be a true NFL team wide receiver 1. He was never that in college, which, given the receivers that he also played with, is perfectly understandable. But there are also a bunch of really good receivers in the NFL that he just might not be a team wide receiver 1. And that's totally fine for fantasy, which is why I compare him to Robert Woods, the poster child of great fantasy production as a team wide receiver 2 with multiple top 15 finishes, even if the ceiling wasn't as high as we necessarily want him to be. That, to me, is 100% Emeka Egbuka. Now, on the high end, I do agree that Egbuka can get to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Again, another poster child for a more slot/PPR receiver who just excels at everything and anything and produces elite fantasy numbers. If Egbuka finds himself in a good offense with a good quarterback and can be their wide receiver 1, I don't see why he can't get to Amon-Ra levels in that situation. Maybe it's in New England, maybe it's in Denver, maybe Vegas or Carolina or Washington if Terry McLaurin's starting to age out. There are situations for that to happen in 2025, but it does feel a lot less likely than just being Robert Woods. And on the low end, maybe he's just Tyler Boyd, which Boyd did have 2 1,000-yard seasons in year 3 and year 4 behind AJ Green. He was a very good NFL contributor with basically 75 receptions for 850 yards and a few touchdowns every year, but that just isn't going to cut it for fantasy football. And if Egbuka finds himself in a mediocre or even a poor offense playing behind an elite wide receiver 1, this could be his fate for him. Now, my wide receiver 4 is Luther Burden, and I do put a lot more faith and trust into his 2023 season than I do his 2024 season, which isn't even to say that his 24 season was necessarily bad. Analytically, he was just as involved in Missouri's offense in 2024 as he was in 2023. It's just that Missouri, even though they were somehow 10-3 on the year, they ended up being ranked at the end of the year, sucked offensively, especially through the air. So for Luther Burden, his median comp and ceiling comps are actually both the same player. They're just the same player on 2 different teams. It's DJ Moore, but Panthers DJ Moore as the median comparison, then 2023 Chicago Bears DJ Moore as the ceiling comparison. Burden is 100% a better athlete than he is wide receiver at this current moment, and I think Moore was also a very similar kind of player coming out of college too, even though I do think that DJ Moore was a better route runner at the time. But it took how many years for DJ Moore to finally free himself from Carolina that even though he was putting up 1,000-yard seasons, it didn't really mean much more for fantasy than wide receiver 25-ish numbers because he just didn't score touchdowns. He was a weapon more than a wide receiver. But in Chicago, DJ Moore's game was unlocked and he was used everywhere like a true wide receiver 1, and his production followed as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. And I think Burden falls somewhere in between there as Panthers DJ Moore versus Bears DJ Moore. It really just depends on the landing spot and the offense in terms of how the team's going to use him, as well as Luther Burden's own personal growth as a wide receiver, more so than just an athlete. Now, as a low-end comparison, it's Paris Campbell. And yeah, Campbell's Achilles heel was injuries. Almost quite literally, it was his Achilles heel. But Campbell is a perfect example of an athlete that played wide receiver that just didn't translate to the NFL at all. He had one season where he was mostly healthy and he put up 600 yards and 3 touchdowns on 91 targets. So if Burden struggles to translate to the NFL, I could see him kind of being the exact same way. My wide receiver 5 then is Tre Harris, a name that I feel just continues to slide under the radar in this class in favor of everybody that we've already mentioned, plus some more names that I have behind him. I don't know if people are just writing him off or if he just doesn't pop enough for people to talk about him as much, but I do think that he is a very good player. He initially began as my wide receiver 3 back in December, and while I've cooled a little bit since, I don't think that he should be dismissed as he offers a very intriguing set of skills and traits to be an immediate NFL wide receiver 2 producer with team wide receiver 1 upside. Now, my initial comp for him is Courtland Sutton, and I don't really super love that comparison because I think Sutton was a better wide receiver coming out of college, was a bit bigger, so he projected more as an X receiver than a Z, but in terms of fantasy production, Sutton's really been up and down his entire career. The ACL injury early on did kind of kill him, but he's been mostly fine since and was a top 20 wide receiver last year with Bo Nix. Like I said, this comparison might be more like 60 to 70% outcome for Tre Harris as opposed to just a base 50% outcome, but I still think it works just fine. Now for upside, I think that he can be Chris Godwin. He'd need to work on his route running to get to Godwin's level, but again, for fantasy, it took a couple years early on, but then he became a perennial top 20 guy with top 10 upside in big PPR seasons or with that good touchdown volume. That is what Chris Godwin has mostly been his entire career in Tampa Bay. And the team still had a more prototypical ex-receiver across from him in Mike Evans, but Godwin was still just too good to not get fed the ball 8 or more times a game, and he thrived in that role for fantasy football. But as a low-end comparison, Harris could just be Terrace Marshall. Maybe he gets opportunity early on, but he just doesn't really do anything with it, and he's a name to look back on in a few years and just say, man, what could have been. Then as for my wide receiver 6, we get to Matthew Golden, another name that I highlighted with Shedeur Sanders in my overrated rookies video, but I do get the hype for Matthew Golden. I've watched the tape, I see the route running, I see the separation, the explosiveness and speed after the catch. I think Golden can be very good in the NFL. I just get worried with receivers with the production profile that he has because it usually is smart to just avoid those guys outright. As a median comparison, I don't think people are going to like this, but I really don't think that Darnell Mooney is all that off, especially if he lands somewhere where he can be more of a team wide receiver 1B early on, like Mooney was in Chicago with Allen Robinson and then after A-Rob fell off a cliff. Mooney had a 1,000-yard season in year 2, then nearly put up 1,000 yards again in 2024 with the Atlanta Falcons. He's not a bad fantasy wide receiver, he's just more of a flex guy that if you predict the right games, he can go off, but he could also disappear from games because he's probably not the wide receiver 1 on his own team. Jordan Addison also comes to mind as maybe a better wide receiver 2 comp if he's on a good team with a good quarterback, but still behind an elite wide receiver 1. Now, as an upside comp, I'm looking at Brandon Cooks, who was able to be a team wide receiver 1 for multiple teams across his career, and he thrived everywhere he went. He's put up 1,000-yard seasons in New Orleans, New England, LA, and Houston. Wasn't even that bad in Dallas either at 30 years old. Cooks had the speed. He had good volume. He was able to find the end zone. He was just a good wide receiver that you had to get the ball to, even if he wasn't the true alpha wide receiver 1 of your team. If Golden truly hits in the NFL, I would expect that he looks a lot like what Brandon Cooks was for most of his career. And for a low-end comp, I mean, pick your poison because we've just had a good amount of these guys come through the NFL. They have a ton of speed. They have very little collegiate production. If those things truly hamper him at the NFL level, you're looking at John Ross 2.0, Kadarius Toney 2.0, Mecole Hardman 2.0. That is the floor for Matthew Golden, which does make him a very high upside, but also a very low floor bet if you are drafting him in your rookie drafts. Now, again, for the sake of the video, I'm not going to run through my wide receiver 7 through 15 individually, but there are still a handful of very interesting names, which I think is actually an underrated part of this wide receiver class. Sure, it's not top heavy, but man, if you need a team wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 who could possibly grow into being more than that, this is a pretty solid class for just that type of player. So running through my list, starting at wide receiver 7 goes Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel, Jalen Royals, Kyle Williams, Alec Ayomanor, Ty Felton, Jack Besh, Tez Johnson, and Torrey Horton. Some of these guys will definitely be day 2 picks, in which case you're hoping to find a Terry McLaurin, a Deontay Johnson, a Kenny Golladay, Tyler Lockett type of player. Or you could find a Khalil Shakir kind of guy, maybe even a Puka Nacua in this class, which I do strongly doubt, and I know people have pegged Jack Besh as this year's Puka Nacua. I don't really see that at all, but maybe. I mean, who knows? Romeo Doubs, Darius Slayton might be better comparisons for some of these day 3 guys. Just very good NFL contributors, but probably not very relevant for fantasy football. And finally, we get to the tight end position, and we have a class here that has 2 very, very good names at the top that often get talked about together as we try to differentiate between the two. So I'm also going to group them together to explain the differences that I see. So my tight end 1 in this class is currently Colston Loveland, and my tight end 2, of course, is Tyler Warren. I'm splitting the absolute finest of hairs here because Loveland is a couple years younger and I think is just a better receiver than Tyler Warren, who is more of a complete tight end prospect. And that is where my comparisons go for both of these guys. For Kirsten Loveland, I see TJ Hawkinson. I see a guy who can come into the NFL and catch 5 or more passes a game immediately and grow into that more PPR type tight end who can easily go over 900 yards, if not even over 1,000, catch a handful of touchdowns or more, and be an immediate day one contributor. Whereas with Warren, I see George Kittle. I see a guy who is bigger, much more of a blocker and receiver, and is just a beast in all areas of the game. And now you might think that those comparisons are already upside comps, and they probably mostly are, but I also think that's just how good both of these players are going to be. So much so that their upside comps are literally Travis Kelce for Colston Loveland and Rob Gronkowski for Tyler Warren. That is how good both of these guys can be, and they're in the same draft class, so you get to pick between either one of those guys. If you miss out on one, you get the other one. You get very similar fantasy superstar upside with either one of these guys. But on the low end, I think both are going to be starting tight ends in the NFL, but maybe the fantasy production just doesn't really follow. So Loveland's low end comparison is Hunter Henry, and Warren's low end comparison is Cole Kmet. Both guys have been very solid contributors for their teams, their safety blankets for the quarterbacks, their chain movers, their red zone threats, but they just live in that 600-ish yards range. They catch a handful of touchdowns every year, and that is good for the NFL. Might even be good for a couple top 12 tight end fantasy seasons, but that doesn't really mean anything for fantasy when it's no different than 10 other tight ends at any given point. Then just to finish up the tight end position, my tight end 3 is Harold Fannin. My tight end 4 is Mason Taylor. Tight end 5 is Oronde Gadsden. And tight end 6 is Terrence Ferguson. I will add that I am very prepared to move Mason Taylor to my tight end 3 spot after the draft, as it seems like his draft capital is going to be significantly better than Harold Fannin's draft capital. I've even seen it as far as Taylor being a late first round pick and then Fannin falling all the way to day 3. And if that is the draft capital discrepancy, you best believe that Mason Taylor is going to absolutely be my tight end 3. But when you're talking comparisons with these guys, Fannin's upside comp to me is Zach Ertz, just a PPR guy who, yeah, isn't the best athlete, but he's trustworthy, he's safe, he can move the chains, he can be just fine for fantasy football. Mason Taylor's upside comp is kind of in the Dallas Goedert range. That might be a little bit low, but Goddard's had a couple 700-plus yard seasons, including one 800-plus yard season. He just hasn't been amazing the past couple years because of injuries, and he's playing behind A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. But you put Dallas Goedert somewhere else where he's more of the second option on the team, and I think he would thrive, just like I think Mason Taylor could as well. Now for Oronde Gadsden, I mentioned this in my underrated rookies video that I think that he could get to Darren Waller 2.0. He's just that tall but slimmer, more wide receiver than tight end kind of player that if his skills really do translate and if a team is willing to use him, he could be like what Darren Waller was with the Raiders. Then for Ferguson, I think he could get to a Mike Gesicki level if he's ever started in the NFL. He absolutely crushed the combine, but I don't know if that means all that much. It's really him and Gadsden, I think, are the two names on here that probably end up mostly irrelevant post-draft and probably for their entire NFL careers too, but are at least interesting enough to warrant a mention at the end of this video. But phew, I mean, what a freaking video. Props to you guys if you made it this far. I didn't even think I was going to make it this far. But I did mention my overrated and underrated rookie videos a few times in this video. So if you haven't checked those ones out, you guys can check them out right over here.